Hi, I just wanted to quickly go through chapter one. I'm going to do my best to make it quick. Um, so, in chapter one, it talks about sources of information for who wore what when. And the primary sources are original materials that have not been filtered through interpretation, evaluation, or condensation by a second party. So everything that I'm showing you here is, by its very nature, not a primary source because it's filtered through me. Um, Primary sources are the best source of information, and they are of the period in time that's being studied. So if you wanted to study something from 3,000 years ago, you'd want to be in the presence of something that was 3,000 years old, not someone's best guess of what something looked like, because we're often wrong, which we'll discuss later. So this is an example of a valid, reliable source for something from about 3,000 years ago. And this is an example of an artist representation of what stuff probably looked like when people were wearing it. So this would be a primary source, and it's in a museum. And this is not a primary source. Now, the two work great together, but this alone is not valid. So primary sources include actual items from the period, art that was created during the period. So not even though it's 500-year-old art, if it's depicting something from 3,000 years ago, if it wasn't made 3,000 years ago, then it is not a primary source for 3,000 years ago. So portraits are great. Museum collections are good because they do their best to validate and make sure that things are a primary source, and then they also give you all kinds of provenance and information about the item. Interviews with witnesses who were alive during the period and remember the time period are valid. Newspapers from the time, films when available. We'll talk more about the problems with films later. And photographs, catalogs, ads. So everything that was created during the period is helpful. Anything that was created after the period you're trying to study or discuss is not helpful. Or I wouldn't say it's not helpful. It's not valid. It's helpful. So some things to think about are that films, TV, magazines, portraits, advertising, anything that was created, it was probably depicting the ideal rather than what's real. Films and TV are sometimes exaggerated, or sometimes they're depicting a different time period. Also, films often they have a huge element of whatever is in at the moment that they were made. Um, Often the best things that are preserved are not really the everyday things. So the most of what gets preserved, especially from the really old stuff, it's usually something that's extra special, and it's not something that you would see every day. So people preserve their wedding dresses, which tells us something about the period. But if you want to know what people were wearing every day, you're probably not going to find a lot of, say, jeans and t-shirts because they got worn out and thrown out and recycled. So you see a lot of royal garments, special occasion garments, ceremonial garments, and then also just remember that, again, whatever the artistic conventions or whatever's in at the time, it's going to result probably in an inaccurate depiction of what was going on at the time. And then in the images here, I have a picture of a dress that was worn in 1837. And at that time, Queen Victoria was in mourning, so she was wearing black. And you can see, even though this has been very well preserved, it's no longer black. So that would be confusing if you were studying it as a novice. And then here we have a picture of Elizabeth in a dress at her sister's wedding. And from the picture, we might think that what she was wearing was white, or maybe we knew it was a color, we'd think it was yellow or light pink. But having the real thing, we can see that it was actually blue, probably. Again, colors fade. So again, primary sources are the best sources so that we can see what people wore at a given time, but it's helpful to triangulate. So if you can get like an actual image of something and you can get something written, or if you have a painting, or multiple, like here we have a painting of the garment, we have a picture of the garment, and we have an actual garment. And so between all these, we can tell what was actually happening. So this doesn't tell us everything because she doesn't have all of her accessories on. Apparently, she had flowers pinned to it. So um, you need everything, you need all parts in order to give you an accurate picture. So primary or original sources of evidence, again, include garments, artifacts, diaries, documents, manuscripts, biographies, recordings, videos, photographs, and anything that was created at the time. So this is the real wedding picture, and this is a wedding picture that was created from a TV series. So this is what was really going on in 1947, and this is the 2016 version of what was going on in 1947. So it's a little bit stylized and more modern. So valid sources are officially acceptable, legitimate, authentic, and authoritative. Reliable sources are trustworthy. So valid means it's real, but how do you know what's reliable? What can you trust? So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then just some terminology notes. In this text, clothes, clothing are synonymous and mean wearing apparel. Dress is a general term that includes not only garments and accessories, but all aspects of personal appearance that can be changed. So that could be hair, facial hair, piercing, tattoos, all kinds of things. So anything that has to do with fashion at the moment. And then style is the predominant form of dress at any given period or culture. So styles may persist for a very long or for a short period of time. Also in this text, the term fashion is used synonymously with style after the latter period of the medieval period. Fashion implies styles of a relatively short duration. In this text, costume is used as a synonym for dress by those who work in the museum field and by many scholars who study historic dress. Some scholars prefer to use the word dress because to many people, costume is confusing because they think it means like for dress up, theater, dance, Halloween. So, dress and costume, we're usually talking about what people were wearing. So, clothes and clothing are synonymous for wearing apparel. Dress includes not only garments and accessories, but anything that has to do with fashion at the time. And costume is synonymous for dress, and style is the predominant form of dress for any given period or culture, and fashion implies that it was relatively short lived. The further back in time we go, the harder it is to find out what was being worn and why, because we have very few records. So, to the best of people's knowledge, the people who study this, the earliest clothing appears to have taken the form of draped skirts, cut and sewn trousers, and cape like garments, probably all of which were made from skins. Archaeologists have found needles for sewing, bone scrapers for preparing skins, and bone devices that were probably used for fastening clothing, which are pretty similar to wood and bone toggles that we use nowadays to fasten clothing. And then, according to your book, the earliest textile materials have been found in the Middle East. And these are some images from museums. And then another thing your book talks a lot about is motivations for why people wore what they wore. And there's a lot of reasons why people get dressed and why they put things on. And they include protection, decoration, modesty, and to denote status. And it's generally accepted that decoration is the main reason that people got dressed. So, most cultures use dress to denote status. So, to show who's who. So, who's the king, who's the queen, what position do you hold in the military, are you rich, are you poor? And then this function probably became attached to what people wore sometime after clothing first came into use. And then it's also for modesty, but modesty varies from culture to culture. Um, so just be aware. And then protection. So not everybody was in a climate that required protection. And there were other ways to keep warm. And some people don't get as cold or as hot, so required um, different garments, less or more. Um, Another form of protection is protection from things you can't see. So, amulets, charms, aprons, things to protect you from spirits. So, um, decoration was a really important aspect of dress. It always has been. So, while clothing isn't common to every culture, decoration is common, even if that comes in the form of painting or tattooing or braiding hair. Except for ceremonial garments, garments are subject to some limitations. So, the wearer has to be able to move, to carry the weight of the garment, and to perform duties. The duties assigned to an individual will have a direct influence on how they dress, and the available materials will also influence what people wear. Technology has an impact on what people wear. So, learning to spin yarn and weave fabric changed the way people dressed. And here we have images of people doing weaving fabric in a very manual fashion. And here we have a more modern version. And here we have someone who's spinning yarn using a spinning wheel. So, actually creating the yarns that are woven into fabrics. And another thing that has to do with the way people dress, that has to do with technology, is what kind of colors they can have. So now we have synthetic colors and we can have really bright colors, but historically, bright colors have been hard to come by. And then kinds of dress, so ways we put garments together. So draped dress refers to just folding, pleating, or tying a belt around fabric to hold it onto the body. So a draped garment is generally not stitched. It's so there's no needle and thread holding it together. It's pinned, tied, tucked, um, and a lot of times draped garments are just one piece. They're loose fitting and they're more common to warm climates. Tailored dress are where they take pieces of fabric, they shape them and sew them together. They fit the body more closely, they provide more warmth, and they're less likely to be worn in warm climates, but more likely in cold. Some costume combines elements of both tailoring and draping. And a theme refers to a recurring or unifying subject area. So there's social factors um, that are, humans interacting with each other that create a set of important themes in the study of dress. And then gender is another important theme. So for some reason, most cultures will dress the two genders differently. So again, the word costume comes from the word custom, and people who violate the customs of their culture or socioeconomic class are considered deviant, antisocial, or even crazy. So in the 19th century, French female writer who dressed in men's clothing was considered eccentric. And mental disturbance often first manifests itself in a lack of attention to dress or hygiene, or putting clothing together in a bizarre fashion. In many cultures, dress is also used differently for different ages, and sometimes there is a rite of passage where at a certain age you're allowed to wear a certain thing. So your book refers to a custom where when boys reached a certain age, they were allowed to wear pants, whereas before that, they had to wear skirts. And then in the 19th century, girls would wear shorter skirts, and boys would wear short pants. And then when they got older, they were allowed to wear longer. The girls were allowed to wear longer skirts, and the boys were allowed to wear longer pants. So you can see here this little girl wearing a very short dress, and the boys wearing short pants. This little boy's wearing even shorter pants. So most cultures use dress to denote status or occupation. Um, so the wealthier people are, the more elaborate they could afford to dress. But then as the economy changes, people that aren't of a certain status, like aren't born into royalty, started to be able to um, afford to dress like royalty. And that could be even high religious status. And so the people who are of high status got a little worried and they started creating sumptuary laws. This was thousands of years ago. These pictures are just from a few hundred years ago, but this has been going on for thousands of years. So the people in power who have the control create laws to prevent people under them from dressing in certain ways. Also, the way you dress can denote group membership. So, some clothing is worn to identify with a certain group, formally or informally. So, a uniform would be formal. So, here we have Girl Scouts and Shriners. And then there's informal membership. So, like the safety pin, there were also pinning pencils to the lapel to show support for the people who suffered at the Charlie Hebdo French satirical newspaper. Um, Here, this guy's dressed to show his membership with the Zoot Suiters. And then there was the whole Pantsuit Nation and the pink hats to denote a certain um, philosophical standing. And there's also ceremonial dress. So we have certain things that we wear at certain times in our lives. So um, as of late, it's been customary for people to wear black to show that they're mourning the death of someone. Um, there's white, long baptismal gowns in certain religious ceremonies. There's certain funny hats that we wear when we graduate at certain levels, and costumes that have been handed down through hundreds of years. And then there's a lot of ceremony around wedding as well. So at different stages of life, there's usually ceremonies and associated costumes that go with those ceremonies. Um, Also, one thing that clothing does for us is um, it enhances sexual attractiveness. So, just like in the wild, how the male of the species might be fancier, like as in the case of peacocks and peahens, to attract the opposite sex. And in fashion, we're constantly shifting erogenous zones. So something is in right now and then it changes. So I just have a little quickie timeline here. So in the 1700s, it was all about the hips, and then in the 1800s, it shifted from the side to the back. In the 1920s, you notice how everybody's all covered up here. In the 1920s, you start to see arms and legs and necks. And then in the 50s, we go back to a really feminine figure. So in the 20s, it was very straight. And then in the 50s, we go back to hourglass with a little tiny waist. And then in the 60s, we're back into legs again. In the 80s, big shoulders. In the 90s, midriffs. And in spring 2016, it was sort of the opposite of the 80s big shoulders and into bare shoulders. And in 2017, we're probably going to see big shoulders again. Everything's cyclical. Um, so, themes in costume often come from many things in society. It's a form of social communication. So, clothing is a nonverbal language, or sorry, like a silent language. So also something that's important to keep in mind when studying what people were wearing is historical context. There are different things that influence the way people dress. So, politics, laws, regulation, and then there's also emulation. So, this is a picture of an empress with a shawl from Kashmir, the place Kashmir, and there were sumptuary laws that didn't allow people of certain classes to have these cashmere shawls. So just the fact that this is in this picture means that she's royal, even if we didn't know that she was an empress. And then um, Eisenhower has this hat which influences the way people dress in the future, his future. And then this is a picture of Charles Frederick Worth. He designed garments for royalty like Empress Eugene here. More historical themes here. Before World War II, women always wore stockings, but during the war, there was rationing and silk and nylon weren't available. So women were painting lines on their legs to make it look like they were wearing stockings. Another thing that came from wartime in World War One, soldiers were wearing coats in the trenches that became called trench coats, and that ended up turning into a fashion statement. And then also um, during the 90s, Desert Storm also influenced the way people were wearing what people were wearing. There's a lot more camouflage, and we'd seen this before in different ways back in the Vietnam era. So conflict or war is an influence on what people wear. Also, a lot of technology is developed during wartime that ends up being carried over into costume. We got a lot of our synthetic fibers from research that was done um, for the military. And then economic events and trade also influence what people wear. So when the economy is good, it's said that skirts tend to get shorter. So here in the 20s, before the stock market crash, we have a lot of skin showing. So we have arms showing, we have legs showing. And then after the stock market crash, we get covered up and we get more austere. And then trade with merchants in China brought silk to Romans, and so they started wearing, the royalty at least, started wearing silk. So trade affects what people wear. And then production and acquisition of textiles and apparel. So trade allows people to have access to more materials that they don't get in their immediate area. And just, we'll talk more about cultural authentication too. And then also changes in technology. So we saw earlier people were weaving fabric by hand, and then here we see images from the Industrial Revolution, which made clothing more accessible. Before that, almost everybody was making their clothes at home. Everything was done one off. And in the Industrial Revolution, we started to learn how to mass produce things, which made clothing more readily available. Also, during the Industrial Revolution, more people had jobs, so they had more disposable income, and people were less self sufficient. And then also, another way technology changes things. Um, so, automobiles allowed us, and that whole technology of transportation allowed us to get to things faster and get things to us faster, and also change the way we dress because you needed to dress a different way in order to ride in automobiles. Media and communication also change the way people dress. So, before the advent of the printing press and before travel overseas became a thing, um, fashion would move very slowly. And then, so here you can see these are dolls that were made wearing the fashions of the day from overseas. And these dolls were shipped with the fabric, so they were usually made by fabric manufacturers, over to other places that were not so close to the fashion centers, so that women could see what the fashions were in the high fashion areas and how to use the fabric. So they would borrow these dolls and buy the fabric and then make their clothes. And then there's the one of the first fashion magazines was Godey's Ladies Book, and so there would be prints of what people were wearing. So these are some images of what people were wearing in Paris. And so these books started to travel, but it's not like media wasn't as prevalent as it is today. And then later, with the advent of photography, they got yet another way to see what people were wearing. And then, of course, movies and TV also sped up how quickly fashions were adopted. So another thing that influences the way people dress are cross-cultural influences. So once we discover a new society, we are intrigued by them usually, and we start mixing in what they wear with what we wear. And then there's this process of cultural authentication where we adopt things from other cultures into our own things that we didn't have before. And we usually change it up a bit. So this is an image of what people in the 19th century thought people looked like in the Middle East. And this was all very new and exotic. And so Europeans started trying to recreate the look. So you see here a turban that was supposed to be modeled after what people were seeing in the Middle East. And then this is an image of Nehru, who is the Prime Minister of India. And this whole literal shaking of hands created a fascination with India. And so his style of dress was adopted into popular culture. And then back in the 1910s, there was more trade overseas with China and Japan, and more of that information was being brought to Europe. So women would adopt styles that were similar to what they were seeing over in Asia. And then also geography, natural environment, and ecology, the relationship of humans and their physical environment affects the way people dress. So if you live in an igloo, you're going to want to be warm, and that's going to be your primary concern. And if you live somewhere where it's super hot, then you're not going to be too worried about being totally covered up. And then here, your beliefs in will also affect how you dress. So this is an image of instead of a leather vest, a vegan vest. And then another theme that's explored in this book is relationships between the costume of a particular area and developments in fine and applied arts. So again, things get stylized. So here you see similarities between Gothic cathedral and women's headdress in the Middle Ages, and it even gets translated down to the feet. So artists of all kinds are influenced by the same things at the same time, and so whether you're creating buildings or shoes or hats or women's clothes or interior decor, you're all going to have sort of the same aesthetic, and so that's one of the things that we explore. And we call that zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times. So conventions and customs determine the form and content of art in any given period. So that's one of the things that we look at. So here's some more examples. There's connections can be made in Victorian times in the elaborate, highly decorated costume and the elaborate, highly decorated interiors of the buildings, and even the Victorian homes. You can see how there's similarities in all of that, in the architecture, the furniture, and the clothing. And then here we have some pictures from the 20s, and the Art Deco theme can be seen in the clothing, in the interior elements, and in the exteriors of buildings. And then another theme that's explored in your text is the relationship between costume and work of individual artists and designers. And they outline just a few. As we go through the book, we'll go through a lot more of them. But one of the designers they point out is Paul Poiret. Um, he did a number of notable things in fashion that you'll see in museums. So this here is the hobble skirt. So he made the bottoms of skirts so narrow that women would have to shuffle along in really tiny little steps. And then he was very influenced by Asia, and so there were a lot of Asian themes in his designs. This is called the lampshade dress. So he had a lot of extreme things. He has this hobble skirt, he has this lampshade dress, and then he is credited with being among the first high fashion designers to put women in pants. This here is actually a costume, it's not for someone to wear out. And most of these are like party dresses, but this one here specifically is like for a costume party. Coco Chanel is another designer that they point out. She also changed the way women dressed and simplified it and made it more conducive to a more active lifestyle. She was credited with being among the first to incorporate knits into women's wardrobe. So this is a 1924 knit dress. At this time, this knit fabric, it's actually wool, it was reserved for underwear. And then another thing she did was she's credited with being among the first to introduce the little black dress. So this is from 1927. And what her probably most recognizable look is this Chanel suit. So like a tweedy suit with braid and the gold buttons. Of course, the chain belt with the leather woven through it, the pearls, and then the gardenia motif you'll see a lot. And then also Madeleine Vianney is another influential designer. You can see how before Vianney came along, costume was very structured and tailored. And one of the things that she's credited with doing is introducing the bias cut. So fabric is woven in two directions, vertical and horizontal, and it's very stable. And what she did was turned the fabric on a 45-degree angle around the bias, which allowed the fabric to stretch even more than the knit that you see in Chanel's designs. And a lot of her garments were very fluid, and the shapes were very irregular, um, and they clung to the body instead of making the body conform to them. So they're very loose-fitting, stretchy, soft garments. And instead of producing the patterned shapes for her garments in the traditional manner, you can see here, she's taking the fabric and placing it on a little doll that she had created. And she's creating the basic shape of a garment with the fabric first, where normally it's done with measurements and paper first. So that was her influence on fashion. And then we have Christian Dior. He started designing before the war, and like I said, during World War II, there was lots of rationing and a lot of materials weren't available. And women's skirts couldn't be below a certain length to save fabric, and they also couldn't be beyond a certain width in order to save fabric. And women were dressing very manly during World War II because all the men were off to war and the women had to do the work. So they couldn't be wearing corsets and high heels. They had to wear things that were more conducive to working. So you may have seen images of Rosie the Riveter. So it's a woman with her hair tied up in a headscarf and she's wearing overalls and she's flexing her muscle. That's what women were doing while the men were off at war. Well, as soon as the war was over, he was credited with being among the first to bring back femininity. So this here is considered to be the only revolution in fashion. and it's called The New Look, and it came out in 1947, which was the end of World War II. And this particular piece is called the bar suit. And you can see how it has a little tiny waist, and there's actually padding in here to make the hips more pronounced. And there's probably padding up here to make the bust more pronounced, to give her a more hourglass figure instead of a little tiny figure. And then there's oodles and oodles of fabric in this skirt. So it's a huge full skirt. Um, and so this revolutionized the fashion of the time. And then I have some notable images of his designs throughout the next couple of decades. Another thing we have to be concerned about when we're studying fashion is artistic license. So I've mentioned before that whatever the convention is of a given time, it's going to impact the way people depict what's being worn. So you also have to know a bit about the history that you're studying and the history before and what came after it. So here we have a painting by Rembrandt, and he liked to dress people up. So again, there was a fascination with all things overseas, so Asian and Middle Eastern. So he just dressed a guy up like this. It's not what they were wearing in his part of the world at the time. He was just making an interesting painting. And then another painter, Gainsborough, they mention in your book, he liked to dress people up too. And this is an example. He dressed a kid up to look like she was a poor beggar. Apparently, he made his name by painting these sad looking children. These pieces here are paintings that he's more famous for. These are actually here in Pasadena. And then also another example of artistic license. These Egyptian paintings, they believe that the garments weren't actually that skin tight, but the artist just painted them that way. And then just a point about the aesthetics of a given period. So this is sort of like 100 years, kind of like your timeline project, sort of kind of a timeline of how the ideal figure changed over the course of time. So in 1900 to 1910, this figure called the Gibson Girl was the ideal. So it's got this big, full bust and a serious curvature in the waist, and then a big full hip and backside. And she's got a total S curve. So you lean forward in the front, and the bust sticks out, or the bum sticks out. And then 10 years later, the flapper became the new ideal for a woman's figure. So unencumbered by corsets, although they really did wear corsets under there because they were trying to flatten themselves out. So instead of padding and boning to look like this, they were putting boning in to flatten their bust and flatten out their hips and make themselves look more straight. And then in the 30s, we went back to a little more curvature. So women were wearing not corsets, but girdles and different kinds of bras and foundation garments to give themselves a curvy shape. And then 10 years later, it became a more athletic type figure. So this, by the way, is Mae West, and this is Rita Hayworth. They're both actresses. And then 10 years later, in the 50s, Marilyn Monroe became the ideal feminine figure. Not as athletic, softer, healthy, curvier. And then 10 years later, in the 60s, Twiggy became the ideal. So she's 5'11", and she's very, very thin and straight and not curvy like Marilyn, who I think was around 5'4", 5'6". And then in the 70s, we shifted back to being athletic again. So Farrah Fawcett became the ideal, and with her free flowing hair, minimal makeup, she just looked like a sun-kissed athletic California girl. And then 10 years later in the 80s, Jane Fonda became a symbol of an ideal figure. So a different kind of athletic, but also very thin. And then in the 90s, Kate Moss is sort of emblematic of the heroin chic that came into fashion. And then 10 years later, in 2000, Adriana Lima is sort of representative of the tall, leggy figure with defined abs and a big bust and curves, but very unusual curves. And we often find that in fashion that whatever's in is something that's hard to attain. So we have a lot of choice right now, and food is readily available, and our lives are relatively sedentary. So it's hard to look thin. Therefore, thinness is the ideal. In times of, of like famine and when food is not readily available, then a fuller figure tends to be um, more in. And right now, population is at a high. The growth rate is diminishing, but we still have a lot of people. So fertility is less important than it used to be. So feminine shape, like exaggerated feminine shapes, like back here, are less important, and more fit characteristics, athletic characteristics are more interesting to us now because they're harder to attain. So just a sort of a little visual of how the figure has changed, the ideal figure has changed through time. Now, these are ideals, they're not reality, and that's kind of the point. You look at these images and they're stylized, they're carefully chosen and carefully staged, and they don't depict the average population. This was just the ideal. So that's something that you need to be aware of as you're doing your research. You have to be careful what you choose because there's the ideal and then there's what's real. And a lot of times people think that looking someone 100 years from now could look at these and be like, wow, everybody in 2017 was so tall and fit, and they all were the same color. Wow. And it's just not the case. People are actually all different shapes and sizes, and what is being worn on the runway gets extrapolated and interpreted to what we actually wear in daily life. So that's basically what chapter 1 is about, is just the themes and costumes and what people wore and the pitfalls in researching. So once you read the chapter, go through the activities and then move on to the next chapter.